Welcome, and thank you for letting these old stories keep you company tonight. This is The Sleeping Shogun, a quiet place where the long night is filled with the slow, gentle tales of old Japan. Tonight we follow a single night in the life of a shinobi, one of the so-called ninja of old Japan. But we will leave behind almost everything the word brings to mind. There are no black masks here, no star-shaped blades flashing in the dark, no figures leaping between rooftops or vanishing in clouds of smoke. Those belong to a later age of theater and story. What we will follow instead is the quiet truth the old manuals recorded. A farmer who leaves his fields at dusk, walks all night through the dark, and does his slow, patient work not by fighting, but by making himself disappear. He does not strike. He does not kill. He learns to soften his footsteps, to slow his breath, to become the shape of a pillar or a stone, and above all, to survive and return home before the dawn. There is nothing here that will startle you. Nothing is hunted, nothing is caught. This is a story of stillness, of patience, of a man made almost entirely of quiet. You do not need to hold on to the names or follow every step. Let them pass through you like the night wind he walked inside of. So settle in now. Adjust your pillow and let your shoulders grow heavy. Let your breathing slow as his, beneath the floor, in the dark. If you fall asleep long before he returns to his fields, that is exactly as it should be. He was always going to make it home without you seeing him go. The Evening Shade. The evening shade, 400 years ago, in the quiet, wooded hills of central Japan. Evening did not arrive with any grand announcement. It came as a slow cooling of the air, a gradual darkening of the cedar slopes, and the soft, dry rustle of wind moving through rice fields. In a small village tucked into the folds of Iga, a man stopped his work in the dirt. He was a cultivator of crops, a man whose hands knew the weight of wet earth and the curve of a wooden hoe. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his forearm, leaned his tool against the wooden wall of his shed, and looked out across the valley as the last orange light bled from the sky. To anyone watching from the narrow trail above, he was merely a farmhand wrapping up another long day of labor. But as the shadows lengthened, his preparation began, not with the drawing of weapons or the donning of armor, but with a quiet, deliberate dismantling of his own presence. He went indoors and sat on the worn wooden floorboards of his back room. In the dimming light, he brought out a small blade and began to trim his fingernails. He cut them back close to the quick, paring away every rough edge until the tips of his fingers were smooth and short. A torn nail on a wooden fence or a rough stone wall could split in the dark, causing a sudden, involuntary gasp of pain or leaving a tiny trace of blood behind on a timber. Every detail of the human body was something that had to be managed, softened, and controlled. Next came his clothing. He reached for his sash and his sleeves, retying every cord with firm, double knots. Loose fabric rubbed together when a man walked, creating a faint, rhythmic friction, a soft swish of cotton that the old texts called the rustle of clothes. In the dead of night, when the wind died down, that tiny sound could carry across a courtyard to a sleeping sentry. He pulled the knots tight, smoothing the cloth flat against his skin until his garments moved as a single, silent piece with his body. Even his breath had been prepared long before the sun went down. For days leading up to a night journey, he had avoided foods with sharp, lingering odors, garlic, wild chives, and heavy spices. A sentry standing watch in the dark might not see a shadow, but a sudden drift of garlic-scented breath on a night breeze could rouse a guard dog or make a sleeping guard turn his head. He had stripped his body of scent, turning his breath as plain and odorless as the night air itself. Later centuries, looking back through the lens of theater and popular romance, would picture him dressed in jet-black cloth from head to toe, a hooded phantom moving across rooftops. But pure black is a color rarely found in nature. On a moonlit night, a man draped in solid black stands out as a sharp, artificial void against the softer grays of stone and timber. It catches the pale light and casts a hard, noticeable silhouette. The real Shinobi wore no such uniform. His clothes were the ordinary, coarse garments of the countryside, dyed in kakishibuiro, a dull, reddish-brown made from fermented persimmon juice, or the dark, muted indigo of local weavers. They were the colors of dried mud, oak bark, and wet leaves. If he stood still against a cedar trunk or crouched beside an unpainted wooden fence, the night absorbed him completely. He did not look like a shadow. He looked like nothing at all. Before stepping out into the twilight, he checked his small collection of tools. The manuals of his trade would later group these essential items together as the 6 basic tools of his trade. He picked up his broad, woven straw hat, which shaded his face from view, while allowing him to look downward without attracting notice. He checked his length of tough, hand-spun hemp rope fitted with an iron hook at one end, coiled tightly so it would not clatter. He folded his 3-foot cotton cloth, a simple strip of fabric that could be wrapped around his face, used to bind a wound, steeped in water to filter muddy streams, or tied into a sling to help scale a barrier. Finally, tucked deep into the inner fold of his sash, he placed his uchitake. This was a small cylinder of bamboo, fitted with a cap and lined with ash, holding a tiny, slow-burning ember of tinder inside. It was a portable spark, a way to carry fire through the damp night without generating light or smoke. As he adjusted his sash, he could feel the faint, steady spot of warmth pressing against his ribs, a quiet, comforting heat in the gathering chill. There was no dramatic moment of departure. He did not leap over fences or melt into a cloud of smoke. He simply opened his back door, stepped onto the earth path in his ordinary work clothes, and walked out into the cool evening air. The valley was turning gray, then navy, then black. Behind him, the smoke from the village hearths drifted up into the trees, smelling of pine and cooking fires. Ahead of him lay miles of dark trails, forested ridges, and unfamiliar compounds. He set his face toward the hills, walking at an unhurried, steady pace, disappearing into the landscape long before the first stars appeared. The silent path. The silent path. The night did not fall all at once. It settled slowly into the valleys, pool by pool, until the sharp outlines of the cedars blurred into a continuous, heavy darkness. Leaving the last scattered lights of the village behind, he moved along the narrow tracks that cut through the foothills. Here, on the unpaved paths of the countryside, the earth was rarely predictable. There were damp patches of clay, loose gravel that clattered under a heavy heel, and dry pine needles that rustled like paper at the slightest touch. A man walking normally, even in soft footwear, left an unmistakable trail of sound behind him. To pass through this landscape unheard required a complete alteration of how the body moved. The shinobi did not stride forward with weight landing heavily on the heel. Instead, he used a series of specialized steps that the old manuals set down by name, each designed to neutralize the sound of his weight meeting the earth. In the stealth step, he lowered his feet with extreme control, placing the outer edge of the foot down first, then rolling the sole inward until the entire footprint rested on the ground. By keeping his knees soft and his center of gravity low, he could feel through the thin soles of his straw sandals, sensing a brittle twig or a loose stone before committing his full weight to the step. If the ground was particularly dry or covered in dead leaves that promised to crackle underfoot, he shifted to a wider, lower stance. He swept his leading foot in a gentle outer arc, clearing small debris silently before setting his weight down, or held his body close to the damp earth in a crawling motion where his hands checked the path ahead. Each step was a deliberate, two-part decision. First, tasting the ground with a light touch, then settling weight onto it only when silence was assured. Yet no human body, no matter how carefully trained, can eliminate every sound. The true skill lay not in absolute silence, but in synchronization. The night was never entirely quiet. The wind moved through the upper canopy of the pines with a steady, ocean-like surge. Frogs called from the flooded rice paddies, and rain, when it fell, created a broad, white noise across the forest floor. The shinobi listened to these natural rhythms, matching his movements to the environment. He stepped when the wind gusted through the trees, moved as a passing cloud muffled the moonlight, and froze motionless the moment the breeze died down and the forest fell still. He did not fight the night. He rode its natural noise. Eventually, the soft earth gave way to the sharp, artificial edges of a fortified compound. Before him rose a dry moat, a steep earthwork bank, and a wall of thick timber topped with heavy plaster. To an ordinary intruder, such a barrier was an absolute end to the path. But to a man carrying the right tools and the knowledge to use them, a wall was simply another surface to be negotiated. From the coil at his hip, he unfastened his iron hook attached to its length of hemp rope. He did not swing the hook in broad, noisy circles over his head as later stories might suggest. A clanking iron hook striking stone was a clear signal to any sentry nearby. Instead, he worked quietly at the base of the wall. If the barrier was high, he used a flexible ladder of knotted rope, securing it to existing timber joints, or carefully placed the iron hook over the top beam of a wooden fence, where the iron was wrapped in cloth to deaden the sound of contact. Testing the line with his full weight, he pulled himself up, his feet finding tiny irregularities in the rough-hewn timber. The air near the top of the wall was cooler, carrying the faint scent of damp plaster and the distant smell of wood smoke from inside the compound. Below him, the water of the inner ditch lay black and motionless, reflecting nothing of the cloudy sky. Reaching the top edge, he did not climb over immediately. He lay flat against the roof tiles or the upper timber, his chest pressed to the cool surface, listening. The wind carried the faint sound of a watchman's wooden clapper far off in the inner courtyard, and the low, rhythmic croak of night frogs near the ditch. Satisfied that his arrival had passed unnoticed, he slid over the crest, lowering himself down into the dark shadow cast by the boundary wall, disappearing once more into the quiet of the estate. into the shadows, into the shadows. Once inside the outer wall, the nature of movement changed again. Across the dark courtyard, the sharp, open lines of the compound offered few places to hide, and the moon, drifting between high clouds, periodically flooded the gravel paths with pale, silver light. Out in the open, a man standing upright was immediately visible. His shadow stretched out long and black against the whitewashed walls. The shinobi had to alter not just his step, but his entire shape, dissolving his human outline into the surrounding structures. This was the art of concealment, described in the ancient manuals through names drawn from the natural world. When approaching a large timber pillar or the trunk of a tall pine, he used one of the quiet posture techniques passed down through his order. Pressed flat against the wood, his hands folded close to his chest, and his body held completely rigid, he became an extension of the timber itself. To a weary sentry glancing casually across the dark courtyard, the extra width of the pillar looked like nothing more than a natural shadow cast by the eaves. In open spaces, where no tall structures existed, he shifted his weight low to the earth. Rolling his body into a tight, low ball, he pulled his knees to his chest and tucked his head beneath his arms. Dressed in his dull, earth-toned garments, he ceased to look like a man. He became a dark rock, a mound of garden soil, or a bundle of dry thatch left behind by the caretakers. He waited in this crouch, unmoving, until the patrol passed by. There's a picture, still widely held, of the shinobi strapping wooden boards to his feet. Water spiders, they are called, and running lightly across the surface of a river, gliding over it like a water strider on a quiet pond. That picture is younger than it looks. It does not come from the old manuals at all. It comes from a single drawing made in the last century, in which a later student of the art added a foot strap to the center of the wooden ring, and every retelling since has copied the drawing rather than the text. Measured honestly, no wooden float of that size could bear the weight of a grown man standing upright on open water. The water spider was a far simpler, more practical tool, a hinged set of wooden segments tied together, used not to run across deep rivers, but to cross muddy swamps, reedy shallows, and soft riverbanks without sinking knee-deep into the silt. The shinobi did not walk upon the water. He merely avoided being trapped by the mud beneath it. When he needed to cross deep water, he slipped into the cold current without a splash, submerging his body completely until only his nose broke the surface beneath a patch of floating weeds. Moving closer to the main residence, he sought the darkness that lay beneath the raised floors. Japanese buildings, resting on heavy stone foundations, left a low, shadowed space between the damp earth and the wooden floorboards above. Sliding on his stomach through the narrow gap between the stone footings, he pulled himself into the cool, dust-scented dark under the house. Above him, the thick wooden planks creaked softly as the occupants of the house moved from room to room. Down here, surrounded by the smell of dry timber, old soil, and the faint, bitter scent of incense seeping down through the floorboards, he pulled his body into the shadows of the floor joists. He drew his limbs close, lowered his chest to the earth, and prepared to stay motionless, blending seamlessly into the dark framework of the building. The sound of breath, the sound of breath. Underneath the timber floorboards, time ceased to move in hours or minutes. It was measured only by the slow, continuous ebb and flow of the air in his lungs. The human body, when forced into complete stillness, becomes intensely aware of its own presence. The floor joists, resting just inches above his face, pressed down like a heavy sky, and the cold of the damp earth beneath him began its steady work, drawing the warmth from his chest, his belly, and his knees. To remain unnoticed in such a space for hours required more than physical endurance. It demanded a total mastery of breathing. A sudden gasp, a sharp intake of air, or even the soft, rhythmic whistle of nose breathing could slice through the quiet of a sleeping household. The shinobi lowered his heart rate through a deliberate, deep pattern of abdominal breathing. Drawing the air far down into his diaphragm, he expanded his stomach rather than his chest, keeping his shoulders completely still. He exhaled through slightly parted lips, releasing the breath so slowly, so evenly, that a feather held before his face would not have swayed. As the night deepened, the minor discomforts of the body grew into sharp, persistent demands. The sharp edge of a stone beneath his hip pressed hard into the bone. A muscle in his thigh began to quiver with tension, and the damp chill of the ground crept deep into his joints, making his fingers feel thick and numb. In the ordinary world, a man moves to relieve a cramp or shifts his weight to ease an aching joint. Here, under the floor of an enemy compound, a single movement of an elbow against the dirt or the soft scrape of cloth on a timber beam meant discovery. He held the pain, acknowledging it without allowing his limbs to react, allowing his body to become as unyielding as the stone foundation beside him. In the complete darkness, his eyes adjusted, reaching out into the shadow until the thick joists and heavy support posts began to resolve into faint, charcoal shapes against the dark. Above him, the house breathed its own slow rhythm. A floorboard groaned as the wood settled in the night air. A draft moved through the paper screens of the rooms above, carrying the faint, dry smell of straw mats and the cool scent of midnight air. He listened to the silence of the building, matching his slow, shallow breathing to the quiet around him. His lungs filled slowly, held the air in the stillness of his chest, and released it in a long, soundless stream. The rise and fall of his belly was the only moving thing in the dark cavity beneath the house. There was no action to take, no target to strike, no decision to make. His entire existence was narrowed down to this single, quiet task: to occupy space without leaving a trace, to exist in the house without the house knowing he was there. Outside, a light rain began to fall, the soft tapping of drops on the roof tiles blending with the dark. Beneath the floor, in the absolute quiet of the timber frame, there was only the slow, imperceptible passage of air and the faint, steady rhythm of a heart beating in the dark. Unwritten Words. Unwritten Words. As the long hours of the third watch began to pass, the silent shadow beneath the floorboards transformed from a passive fugitive into an active observer. To gather intelligence without revealing one's presence was the quiet core of the trade, the discipline the old manuals referred to as the unseen practice. Through the narrow gaps in the floorboards, where the timber had dried and shrunk over decades, he watched the small, ordinary movements of the enemy compound. He did not need to see the entire room to understand what lay within it. The warm, yellow flicker of a paper lantern cast long, swaying shadows across the ceiling above, telling him where the guards were seated. He listened to the distant, rhythmic thud of a sentry's straw sandals on the veranda, measuring the interval between each pass. He drew in the surrounding air, noting the sharp, dry smell of tobacco smoke drifting down from a guard room, and the faint, sweet scent of steaming rice coming from the distant kitchen, signaling that the early morning preparations had begun. Every sight, sound, and scent was a fragment of a larger puzzle: the strength of the garrison, the alertness of the watch, and the daily rhythm of the estate. Yet the most dangerous part of the task was not the gathering of information, but the keeping of it. He carried a writing implement, as the manual said he should, a stub of stone for marking a beam or a wall. But plain words on paper were another matter. If a man was seized on his way home with a legible document in his sleeve, it served as undeniable proof of his crime and revealed the identity of those who sent him. What could be written was written in marks and codes. The rest was best kept where no hand could reach it. To hold such details without the aid of ink, he bound them to the body he was lying in. The stone pressing into his hip was the count of men at the inner gate. The ache spreading through his right shoulder was the position of the grain store. The cold, working its way into his knees, was the hour the lanterns went out. He had been gathering these aches all night without choosing to, and now each one was carrying something. He would still feel them at dawn, walking home, and the walking would keep them in order. Far off in the dark woods beyond the outer wall, the soft, low call of a hoot owl drifted through the night air. It was a gentle, natural sound that would make any tired guard simply adjust his cloak against the damp chill. But to the man beneath the floor, the rhythm of the call was unmistakably deliberate. 2 short notes followed by a long, trailing cry. It was not a bird. It was a companion waiting near the tree line, confirming that the escape route remained clear. Later centuries, enamored with tales of shadow warriors, would picture the shinobi as a master of lethal throwing blades, raining star-shaped iron weapons down upon his enemies from the dark. But those heavy iron points were never meant for battle or silent assassination. They were small, secondary tools of distraction, tossed into a dark corridor or against a distant wooden fence during a hasty retreat to make a sharp noise, forcing a pursuer to pause and turn his head for a crucial second. His purpose in entering the compound was not to kill. To engage in a fight was to risk capture, to risk death, and above all, to risk losing the knowledge he had gathered. His sole mission was to see, to remember, and to return. Above him, the house remained quiet, but the air was changing. The shadows were shifting, and the facts he needed were securely held in his mind, bound together by the dull ache in his palm. He had gathered what he came for. There was no longer any reason to remain. The Unbroken Heart. The Unbroken Heart. In the long hours of watching and waiting, when the chill of the earth pressed through the coarse fabric of his clothes and the body began to ache with fatigue, the true battle was not against the sentries above, but against the mind itself. The skills of entry, concealment, and observation were useless without a firm inner foundation. In the foundational manuals of the trade, the authors placed this inner discipline above all physical techniques, calling it the right mind. This principle was not a matter of abstract philosophy. but a strict code of professional ethics. The manuals explicitly warned that if the methods of stealth were used for personal gain, for greed, or for petty theft, the art would inevitably fail. The skills were meant to be used solely in the service of one's lord, to preserve the peace of the realm, and to bring clarity to times of dangerous uncertainty. To enter a shadow with a divided or corrupt intent was to invite disaster. A mind clouded by personal desire lost its sharpness, made small errors of judgment, and brought destruction upon the practitioner. Central to this ethical framework was a principle that separated the shinobi from common mercenaries: the absolute requirement to survive. The primary objective of any mission was never to seek combat, nor to display bravery through reckless violence, but to return home with the gathered intelligence intact. To engage in an unnecessary fight, to seek revenge, or to die heroically in the dark was considered a total failure of the task. A dead observer carried no stories back to his master. Later centuries, looking back through the romantic lens of fiction, would picture the shinobi as a cold, shadowy assassin, a creature of pure lethality who moved through the night, dealing silent death. But the historical manuals told a very different story, repeatedly emphasizing the preservation of life over the taking of it. The master of the trade was not the one who left a trail of bodies behind him, but the one who passed through an entire castle without a single person ever knowing he had been there. What he cultivated above all else was not the sharpness of a blade, but an inner quiet that allowed him to remain composed in the presence of extreme danger. Beneath the floorboards, as the first faint gray of dawn began to touch the eastern sky, he prepared to move. He did not return by the route he had taken into the compound. A path used once was a path that might now be watched or marked by an alerted guard. To survive, he had to choose a different way out, leaving no pattern for others to follow. He smoothed the dirt where his body had rested, gathered his few simple tools, and began his silent crawl toward the outer boundary, turning his back on the house and setting his face toward the long journey home. The unseen exit. The unseen exit. The shift from deep night to early morning is rarely sudden. It arrives as a faint thinning of the blackness, a slow return of gray to the leaves and the stone walls. In the quiet hours before the first light touched the rooftops, the shadow beneath the floorboards began its silent withdrawal. To leave a compound safely required a discipline equal to that of the entrance. The mind, relieved that the primary task was complete, was tempted to move too quickly, to relax its caution, and to make a careless sound. But he controlled the urge, treating every inch of the retreat with the same slow, deliberate care he had used when he first crossed the outer ditch. He did not return by the way he had entered. To use the same opening twice was to gamble against memory and chance. A path that was clear 2 hours ago might now be patrolled, or a gate that had been left unlatched might have been secured by an early riser. Sliding out from the low foundation gap, he moved along the shadowed base of the outer wall, using a different angle of approach to reach the boundary fence. He cleared the timber wall with the same muffled hook and rope, dropping lightly into the tall grass outside without a sound. Once beyond the perimeter, the task transformed from hiding within a building to navigating the open countryside. If a traveler was spotted on the road at dawn, A man dressed in unusual clothes or looking out of place would draw immediate suspicion. The manuals spoke of a range of forms a traveler could adopt when moving through foreign territory. Disguises that allowed a man to blend seamlessly into the ordinary flow of human life. He could travel as a wandering monk, a mountain ascetic, a street performer, or a merchant carrying a pack of local wares. Yet the purpose of these forms was not merely to escape or deceive. They existed so that a man could shed the tension of the night and return safely to the shape he inhabited every day. His ultimate transformation was not into a performer or a priest, but back into the ordinary form of a local farmer, a man whose presence in the countryside required no explanation at all. Far across the valley, the sudden, clear crowing of a rooster broke through the cool morning air, followed by the distant sound of a wooden shutter sliding open in a farmstead down the road. The eastern horizon was turning a soft, pale blue, outlining the dark ridge of the hills. Walking along a damp dirt track flanked by high grass, he paused behind a thick grove of bamboo. He unfastened the narrow cloth wraps from his lower legs and loosened his sash. His ankles, bound tightly throughout the long night of walking and crouching, felt sudden relief as the cool morning air circulated around them, free to move naturally once again. The return to the soil. The return to the soil. As the pale light of morning broadened across the eastern sky, the shadows in the forest began to fade, dissolving into the dull grays and greens of the countryside. Beyond the outer tree line, the narrow dirt track led back into the familiar hills of his own valley. He walked without haste, his step light and unhurried, leaving no deep footprints in the damp earth. There was no trailing smoke behind him, no sound of alarm rising from the distant compound, and no sign that anyone had passed through the dark interior of the estate. He arrived back at his small timber house before the rest of the village was fully awake. Entering through the back door, he moved silently into the inner room. He did not write down what he had seen, nor did he record the layout of the gates or the numbers of the guards on a sheet of paper. There were no maps to fold, no secret scrolls to hide beneath the floorboards, and no physical evidence of where he had been. The information existed only as a quiet pattern inside his mind, bound to the aches he had gathered in the dark. He removed his damp travel clothes and put on his ordinary, worn work garments, the simple cotton tunic and trousers, stained with the dark earth of his own fields. He was not a shadow warrior belonging to a secret world. He was a cultivator of the land, a man bound to the cycle of planting, rain, and harvest. The small community to which he belonged relied on the collective labor of its members, and his survival depended far more on the yield of his rice crop than on the secrets of stealth. Taking up his wooden hoe from beside the shed, he walked out into the narrow plot behind his house. The morning air was sharp and cool, carrying the fresh scent of wet soil, crushed grass, and the faint, sweet smoke of wood fires rising from the village hearths. A morning mist hung low over the valley floor, clinging to the stalks of the young crops. He raised the hoe and brought it down into the heavy clay, the iron blade entering the soil with a soft, clean sound. The same hands that had gripped the roof beams in the dark, that had checked the tension of a hemp rope, and that had held a burning ember in a bamboo tube, now worked the dirt, turning the earth for the day ahead. Across the valley, the routine of another day began. A neighbor called out a greeting from a nearby terrace. An ox pulled a wooden plow through the mud of a flooded paddy. Birds settled into the branches of the cedar trees. No one looked at him with suspicion, and no one asked where he had been in the night. His victory was not marked by a fallen enemy or a captured fortress, but by the quiet continuation of his ordinary life. He had gone into the dark, he had seen what was hidden, and he had returned unharmed to his own ground. The morning sun rose higher, warming the damp earth beneath his feet, and the quiet work went on. If these quiet hours have carried you gently toward sleep, then the night has done its work. Should you wish for more of these slow journeys, you are always welcome to follow the channel, so that the next long night finds its way to you. If the quiet suits you, there are other nights here. There is an ordinary day in the old city of Edo, from the dawn bell to the last dark street. There is the long, quiet life of a woman called Gracia, told by the light of a single lamp. And there is a night among the yokai, the gentle creatures of the old countryside. All are long, all are slow. None of them will wake you. But there is nothing left for you to do now. Adjust your quilt once more. Let your breathing settle into the slow rhythm of the dark, and rest easily and completely until the day is fully wide.